Okay, so I wanted to open this up from your perspective, the presentation, just to see what it looks like. Okay, so this is Science and Technology, and it's in the late 19th century. And why we're going over this is it's really connected to imperialism. How is it connected? Well, it's because progress, scientific progress, anyways, it just exponentially, it just grows. It explodes after 1870. There are all these advances that happen in a 30-year period, and they really change the ideology of the West and how it views itself, and also the society that was alive at the time. They have a different view of themselves than they're going to have in the 20th century. Okay. The other thing is these ideas that spring from this, from like 1870 to 1900, they're going to be used to justify this view of racism that Europeans and Americans have, that they think justifies their right to dominate the rest of the world. So we start with the natural sciences, and we go over this because, you know, up until this point, anything that people needed to understand, they turned to their priest, or they read the Bible, and things started to change early on with the Industrial Revolution. You've got machines that are being made, right? And so, hand in hand with that are the works of the Enlightenment, which are questioning pretty much everything, like divine right of kings, class system, roles of men and women, all kinds of things, right? So that was the seed. The Enlightenment was the seed. And in the 19th century, those things come to fruition. And, some of the fruit that was born is not so great. So, getting back to this though. So, science and scientists, because of their ability to do all kinds of like crazy things, like understand, the world around us, they begin to be looked upon as oracles of wisdom. And then the scientists at this time, they're very confident or very self-assured that what they think or what they say is correct. They're very high on the horse, as some people would say. As the states right here, up till about 1860, 1870, science was based on mechanical views of the universe. So they used Newtonian physics and Euclid's geometry, and the nature of the universe was seen as being harmonious, timeless, and unchanged. Remember, the galaxy is a static thing. It's not expanding or contracting, all that good stuff. And then the inventions that were made were improving the quality of life of people up to this point. Like, for example, being able to mine coal meant that you had a cheap way to heat your home. Now, I have the American Museum of Natural History because these things start to actually develop. People begin to collect things and put them into museums. People actually have the time to study this stuff. Before the Industrial Revolution, people didn't have a whole lot of free time. What the scientists or these natural philosophers began to do is they began to categorize things, collect things, and try to understand what was going on. You've got dinosaurs. People in the past would dig these things up or see these things, and they would say, oh, these are the bones of giants, right? So they used what they understood and then applied it to what they saw. Well, this is a whole new way of understanding things. So geology. So in 1785, you got James Hutton. He's Scottish. He argues that the Earth is a lot older than was previously thought. Many people argue that the Earth is like 5,000 years old. Tradition taught the chronology of what's this guy. He's called the Bishop of Ussher. He's a 16th century Irishman, and he believes that creation began on Sunday, October 23rd, 4004 BC. So that's where we get the 5,000 years, or 6,000, I guess. And he did this by looking at the Bible, and he figured this out. Okay, 1830, we've got Sir Thomas Lyell. He's from Great Britain. He promotes what's called uniformitarianism, which is the slow geological change. Processes are always going on. And he was influenced by Darwin's work, in that the Earth is undergoing evolutionary change. And so if the Earth is doing that, or if animals are having this, why wouldn't the Earth be going through the same thing? And you can contrast this with what's called catastrophism, which is geological features were formed by a single calamitous events. So, like in the Bible, you've got the flood. So, archaeology, it's the study of human society primarily through the recovery, and then the analysis of the material culture, and then the environmental data from which they've left behind. Which, this includes artifacts, pieces of pottery, jewelry, weapons, things like that, buildings like the architecture, biofacts, and then cultural landscapes. Okay. Now, it's considered both a humanity and a science, depending on the methodology that's used. And in the United States, it's usually considered to be a branch of anthropology. So archaeology is usually considered to be a branch of anthropology, where in Europe, it's a completely different discipline. So prior to the 19th century, archaeology, they were called Egyptologists. And among them were a lot of Muslim medieval scholars, which makes sense because Egypt was under Arab control, still is. It's the largest Arab country in the world. They began to study the Mediterranean ruins during the Renaissance. Europeans did. And then in the 18th century, Johann Joachim Winckelmann, he applied empirical categories to classical Roman Greek art, and he drew reasoned conclusions from the data. So this change to empiricism is important because this is what begins during the scientific revolution. So in the 18th and early 19th century, we have what's called antiquarianism, and it's the study of history with particular attention to ancient objects of art or science in archaeological and historical sites or historic archives and manuscripts, because there are lots of people who have private collections from Roman times or Greek times, and so they begin to collect these things. Now, this is Ole Worm's Cabinet of Curiosities, and this is from 1655. And the reason I have this, and you can see this if you don't have it to full size, can't think of what the word is, but down here, I have some information for you. So Ole Worm, this is a 17th century Danish physician, linguist, and a natural philosopher, and he creates sort of what is the first iteration of a museum. Most learning about the world that had gone on prior to Ole Worm was done through books. People just read about things. Ole Worm, though, he actually collected things. So he's got tortoise shells, polar cub, different fish, whale bones, all kinds of things. And what's interesting about Ole Worm is because of his empiricism, right, like collecting things, studying them, he figures out that down here that a narwhal tusk it's attached to a whale skull, right? It's not part of a unicorn because unicorns don't exist. So it seems easy to understand today, but at the time, people saw something and then they fit it into their worldview. Ole Worm is turning that upside down. So we have the British Museum in London. It does the same thing that Ole Worm does. Same thing at the U.S. Up here, U.S. Museum of Natural History. People are collecting things. People are gathering them in one spot. Then this is Death in the Antiquaries. This is from a book, but the idea here is that people were terrified of death, and they had good reason to be, especially if you think about like the Black Death and things. If you look at this picture, you can see this person who was entombed is being exhumed, and they are studying the body. This is a huge change from what had been done in the past, because for religious reasons, this would have been seen as heresy. And, you could be excommunicated, or the Inquisition could come and do all kinds of fantastically terrible things to you. So the view of life and the view of death is changing. And there's, in part, this is due to science, and it's also due to the Enlightenment. So in the mid-18th century, we got this guy. His name is Thomas Colt Hoare, and he excavates Neolithic barrow sites in Wiltshire. So these are earthen mounds. You dig into them, and people are buried there. In 1784, Thomas Jefferson, he does the same thing on his own land. He excavates an Indian burial site. But one of the things that really explodes the interest in archaeology is when Napoleon was in Egypt, they discovered the Rosetta Stone. And what it does is one section of the Rosetta Stone is in Greek, the other is in hieroglyphics. This meant that for the first time, you could go to Egypt and you could copy down the hieroglyphics and then translate what those hieroglyphics are telling you into Greek, and then you could read it. So it's an important thing. It's huge. And what it does is it brings a lot of Europeans to areas of the Middle East, and they begin to practice archaeology. The only thing is at the time, a lot of the archaeology that they did was quite destructive. But they find things. So in 1811, they begin the excavation of Babylon. 1812, they discover Petra, right here. It's like a city built into the side of cliffs. 1817, they start an extensive excavation in the Valley of the Kings, which is in Egypt. And then in 1828, they do an exhaustive topography of the Holy Land. So we would call it Israel today. So there's a lot of interest going on, and it's non-religious based. So in 1837 to 42, you got Colonel Henry Rawlinson. He explores Persia, and he deciphers Bestun Rock. It's right here. 1840, there's lots of discoveries in Mesopotamia. So remember, Mesopotamia is the Fertile Crescent. It's that area from Jordan through Jordan and Syria, through northern Iraq, parts of Kuwait, and then to the Persian Gulf. And then we have 1843, which is incidents of travel in the Yucatan. So Europeans have begun to go over to Central America and start looking into things. Late 19th century digs, you got Giuseppe Fiorelli. He begins to do plaster casts of the victims of Pompeii. So here's an example of a dog. There's people. Remember this, if you don't know what Pompeii is, it was a volcano that exploded in ancient Roman times, and people were taken by surprise. Many people didn't get out, and they were covered in ash. And while their bodies were gone, the cavity was still there. So you pump that full of plaster casts, and you can see what they look like. Then we've got Heinrich Schliemann. He actually used the epics of Homer, and he backtracked, and he discovers that Troy is actually a real place. It's in what today it would be Turkey. And then some American cowboys, they found these Mesa Verde cliff dwellings. Then you've got Arthur Evans. He buys the Gnosis in Crete. Got this face mask right here made of some sort of metal. And then there's all kinds of excavations in the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Now, this leads to a lot of theft. So there's this thing called collector fads in Europe, and they steal everything. They steal Chinese porcelain, they steal figurines, they steal antique jewelry, they loot India, they loot Egypt, they steal from African tribal governments. Okay, so you've got the Elgin marbles, which are called it's the Parthenon. This is from Greece, and this is in the British Museum today. You've got the winged Nike Samothrace, which is in the Louvre, which is in France. You've got the Code of Hammurabi, which is from ancient Babylon. This is also in the Louvre. You've got the Triptaka Koreana, which is from Korea. It's in France. You got the Stela of Copan, which is from Honduras, and this is at Harvard University. And there are all kinds of examples. Now, do these, does Greece want this back? Yeah, you better believe. And they've written letters and things like that. But, Great Britain has not relinquished its control so far. And then this is the Pergamon. This is from Asia Minor, which is Turkey. And this is an altar. And it's in Germany because it was stolen. And now it's in a museum there. So inventions, I'm not going to go through all the inventions, but you can look at these. There was just this huge growth in a 30-year period of all kinds of inventions, okay? So get the camera. But this is what's important. All right, these are whaling ships, and this is oil that they're bringing back. This oil is used for lighting, okay? You've got coal, you've got water, you've got steam, okay? This is power sources in the 1850s. We're going to move, though, and we're going to be able to make kerosene. We're going to be able to use oil, and we're going to be able to make gasoline in a combustion engine. We have the dry cell. The first cars, not the first cars, but cars were powered by steam and then batteries and then the combustion engine. So Tesla, which seems new and awesome, which it is actually the idea of a battery-powered car comes from the late 19th century. Here you go. Motorcycle, 1885. This is the first automobiles. They were trikes. pneumatic tire, meaning you pump it up with the air. So it's a huge difference, because what this means is that it's no longer a solid piece. It can go over rougher terrain. You get a smoother ride. Radar, 1887. All right. Think of it as now we've changed. We have light bulbs. So the dark has been banished by the late 19th century. All right. So what I want you guys to realize is that there's this, in the early 19th century, we had the Industrial Revolution. So we have this shift from agriculture to industry. We have a shift from rural to urban. And then we have a shift from human labor to mechanical labor. And then we shift from using wood as our primary means of energy to coal. And then there's concerns, remember Malthus, about overpopulation. Now in the late 19th century, we shift to a reliance on science and innovation to explain the world, which is a movement away from religion. There's a shift to science to justify worldviews. So we take something like Darwin's work, which was scientific, and then people will apply it to social settings. And we have social Darwinism, which is terrible. There's a shift to electricity and gasoline. There's a shift away from social and work structures that were determined by the sun, and now it's focused on time. And then we have the invention, most of the inventions that were created during this period, they benefit the masses. Electricity, things like cars, things like that. All right. So The Origin of Species was published in 1859. And Darwin's work on natural selection and survival of the fittest is going to be taken way out of context. The idea is that nature, it moves from being like placid and timeless, right? Like to this constant struggle where the weak are eliminated and that this is seen as proper. And there's moral relativism that comes out of this, which is an adaptation that replaces the virtue of Christianity. And this is a big, big deal because this is where a lot of things that are awful, like what happens in World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, these things, they're seated at this point. Okay, so the concepts are taken from The Origin of Species, which was never intended, but like there's this view that Europeans, and specifically certain people in Europe, are racially or nationally superior to others. The British will feel this way. The Germans will take this to a whole new level, obviously. Then we have this view of the middle class, the bourgeoisie, or the upper classes, that they're fitter than the poor, and that they use that as justification for why they're rich compared to the poor. And then there's moral justification for wars or colonial exploitation. So, for example, when we get to the parts about the divvying up of Africa, back in Great Britain, they'll feel that they're justified in their taking over of large parts of East Africa or South Africa because they're going to Christianize and bring up the savages. That's what they'll begin to call these people, as savages, and that they're the civilized West. So, also there's new scientific fields that are coming into creation, which you guys have heard about. So you got Gregor Mendel and his genetics. He investigates heredity. You've got physical anthropology. It studies races to understand why some were superior. Of course, you've probably never studied that because that is junk science. Then you have cultural anthropology, which applies scientific objectivity to the study of primitive and complex cultures. So it's mores versus morals. Cultural anthropology still exists. They look at like, why do civilizations and cultures go from what they were to something that much more complex, and then often they'll disintegrate. Then you've got anthropology versus religion. It was James Fraser. He's from Scotland. He wrote this, he was born in 1890. He writes The Golden Bough, which treats religion as a cultural phenomenon. So you have open attacks on religion, and there's no consequence. I mean, there's like a backlash against him, but there's no like religious persecution. There's no inquisition that gets sent out after him. So things have really changed by the 19th century. Then we have psychology. It comes into its own. We've got Ivan Pavlov. He's from Russia, and he studies what's called the conditioned response. I know many of you have had psychology, but like it's like you train an animal to do something like push a button or light up a light or bark or whatever, and when they do that, you reward them. And every time they bark, they expect to get some sort of conditioned response, which is they'll get a treat. In this case, it was Pavlov ringing a bell. So he experiments with drooling dogs indicate that animals are trained by their environment and decisions are not the result of conscious reasoning. This is something that's really important to understand about psychology, or just science in general versus like religion. In religion, it's often broken down to good versus evil, and that you have complete free will and that you make decisions. Okay, where in science, they have come to understand that the conscious self is not aware necessarily of the unconscious self, and that the unconscious self has way more to do with how we interact with the world than we had ever thought possible before. Then we got Sigmund Freud, Austria, 1856 to 1939, and his contribution is psychoanalysis. And I'm going to let you guys read this because I don't want to go into the whole thing, but I don't know what you heard about Freud, and maybe in some ways today he's dismissed, but he shouldn't be, because he has a lot of good contributions. For example, his couch. Freud didn't want his clients to look at him because he didn't want his facial reactions or physical reactions, no matter how slight they might be, to in any way impede or encourage his clients. He wanted people to free associate, which just means you just talk. And the idea is that if you're talking, you're thinking, and if you're thinking, you're putting things together. And if you can put things together, maybe you can fix yourself, because ultimately that's how you get fixed, is people would, sort out their problems with their wives and realize their real problem was with their mother or something like that. So have things changed since Freud's time? Yeah. Does everything Freud said hold up today? No. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss him. Okay, so the id, the ego, and the superego, go through this again. All right, Nietzsche. Nietzsche's an important guy. Okay, so Friedrich Nietzsche, he's a German philosopher. So he was born right around the time that Marx was really coming into his own as a writer. So they're not contemporaries. But what Nietzsche does that is important is really, it's this section right here. So Nietzsche does what Freud, not Freud, but what Marx does. He analytically looks at like life, things, people. And what he does is he takes away the old traditional Western religious morality and philosophical beliefs, and he sees that these things are no longer going to fit. And the reason why is because of what happened in the Enlightenment and what happens with science. And what he says is that God is dead. And what he means by that is not that God is dead, but what he means is that Western people's ability to rely on the church to explain everything, that's gone. And that virtues, being good to each other, things like that, that there's going to have to be a new foundation for morality. And it can't be God. It can't be that Christ died on the cross for us. That it's got to be something else. And Nietzsche realizes that this is going to be a problem, and so his work, it slips into what's called nihilism. And nihilism, he realizes, is very bad, because nihilism means that like there's no reason to live and there's no reason to do anything. Like if you wanted to kill everybody, go for it. If you want to kill yourself, that's fine too, because there's no heaven, there's no hell. And this is a bad thing, because if nihilism was allowed to come to its natural conclusion, there wouldn't be any more of us. So Nietzsche's contribution is his understanding of suffering, and that if you had a choice between the suffering or nothing, you would pick the suffering. And I realize that sounds really bleak, but remember, there's lots of good things that happen too. It's not just suffering, but it's an interesting idea. The problem for Nietzsche is that Nietzsche's views are going to be polluted, let's just say. Because during his life, he was an absolute outspoken anti-nationalist. He was against people who are anti-Semitic, and he was against the power politics of the late 19th century, which were being practiced by like Great Britain and France and Germany, places like that. And when he's got a very brief period of time in which he's very prolific in his writing, and he has incredible depth and understanding. And then he mentally breaks, and his sister has to take care of him until he dies. First it's his mother, and then it's his sister. And unfortunately, his sister, who controls his name, she twisted his work to fit her own purposes, which were anti-Semitic. And so, like, people like Adolf Hitler, they were very much Nietzschean. So many people will look at Nietzsche and they'll associate him with anti-Semitism or the Nazi Party, and it's really unfortunate. For one thing, he died in 1900. That was 33 years before the Nazis even really become anything. So there was no real association. So his work is dense. It is difficult to read, but it is very rewarding. Don't give up on it if you get the chance to get there. His work also predicts that the nationalism that was on the rise would lead to totalitarian regimes. And then, so he doesn't like call that there will be the Soviet Union or anything like that, but like Stalin's Soviet Union and Mao's China, which result in the deaths of millions, tens of millions of people, it all stems from this earlier Enlightenment thinking, this questioning of authority, and there's a tie to it. There's a cost to the anti-religiousness that the world goes into as a result of the Enlightenment. All right, we got physics. So Newton's view that atoms are like billiard balls, that there's matter and there's energy and they're distinct. And then we have all of these people. I think that's Becquerel, Pierre and Marie Curie, Thomson and Rutherford. They discover and study radiation. And you've got 1900, you got Max Planck from Germany. He comes up with quantum theory. Matter and energy are not distinguishable as once believed. And then we have Einstein, another German. We have the theory of relativity. Time, space, and motion are relative to the observer. And then we have Bohr from Denmark, and he comes up with atomic theory, and he describes electrons orbiting protons. So lots of things happen here. Okay. Notice too, it's in Europe, and these are Germans. So I'm not going to go over that. I'm not going to go over this. All right, the fringes. So when you have these changes in a very brief amount of time, the world that people understood, they don't understand anymore. So if you think about it, right? You think about electricity. You and I have been surrounded by electricity our entire lives. You guys have been surrounded by the internet your entire lives. If you had been alive in 1850, when you were burning wood and whale oil for lighting, and then all of a sudden you push a button and there's light, it's not necessarily easy to understand. And so some people, just like when we talked about the Luddites and how they destroyed like the machinery that was taking their jobs away, there are people who are going to be against this modernity. And then there are also people who predicted that things were going to get even crazier, or other inventions. So like Jules Verne, he writes Paris in the 20th century. It was written in 1863, but it wasn't published until 1994. And it's a dystopia. And it was set in August 1960 at a society that values only business and technology. He talked about air conditioning machines, skyscrapers, buildings built into the sky, gasoline-powered automobiles, high-speed trains, calculators, something that's like the internet, electric chairs where criminals are executed. These are things that didn't even exist in 1863. But once people had an idea of what you could do with these things, he puts it into vision. So in a way, Verne is sort of like Orwell with his 1984's view of like what's the future going to be like. So Verne in 1865, remember this is the year that the American Civil War ends. He writes Earth to the Moon. So it's a way for people to leave the Earth and then fly to the moon. He writes 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which involves a submarine traveling underwater. And then Around the World in 80 Days, which is done by a hot air balloon. So, occultism. Because Christianity and just religious thought in general was under attack by the fruition of the Enlightenment, and then this move towards secularism, you have a counter to it. which is for the Christian side, it would be what's that called? Fundamentalism. So there are people who think that whatever's in the Bible is 100%, that's God's word, and so even if it's contradictory in places, it doesn't matter. This is the written word of God. Okay. Then we have another group of people who reject Christianity, and they come up with what's called occultism. So it's the base. Occultism has its basis in a religious way of thinking, the roots of which stretch back into antiquity, and which may be described as the Western esoteric tradition. Its principal ingredients have been identified as Gnosticism, the Hermetic, followers of Hellenistic esoteric Hermes, treatises on alchemy and magic, Neoplatonism, and the Kabbalah, which is the Jewish mysticism or Hebrew mysticism, all originating in the Eastern Mediterranean area during the first few centuries after the death of Christ. So here's some personalities from the time. So you got Franz Anton Mesmer. He's a German and a French guy who, in the late 18th century, he coins the term animal magnetism, and he begins what is the foundation of hypnotism. Then you have Madame Blavatsky. She's from the Ukraine. She'll travel to Russia and then later to the United States. She claims that she's a psychic, a mystic, a channeler of spirits, and she's the founder of the Theosophical Society. And she's a broad-thinking seekers of truth. That's what the Theosophical Society. And then you have Aleister Crowley, who, if you don't know who this guy is, definitely look him up. He's very interesting. He's an influential English occultist, astrologer, mystic, and ceremonial magician, and he's the founder of the religious philosophy of Thelema. The whole of the law shall be to do what thou wilt. He's a polytheistic, meaning multiple gods, based on ancient Egyptian gods in ritual magic. If you watch Robert Downey Jr.'s version of Sherlock Holmes, not the second one, but the first one, Aleister Crowley's hinted at in that, and so is occultism, because if you remember, there's that secret society and stuff, so that's where this stuff comes from. And then we have the rise of pseudoscience. So there's phrenology, which is the study of the human skull. People would put their hands on people's skulls, and you can read the indentations, and you could tell who was a criminal or who was going to be successful. I mean, it's just all crazy, but it was people pushing back against what they didn't understand, and then saying that this was an established science. All right, then we have Ignatius Donnelly. He's a U.S. congressman. He's a populist, so that's like Trump, America First kind of person, and an amateur scientist. And he wrote Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, in 1882. And if you don't know what Antediluvian is, that means it was before the flood. And then you have Ragnarok, the age of fire and gravel. So that's the end of the world, right? Then you have therapeutic spas. So, for example, Battle Creek, there was a sanitarium there. So Battle Creek, which we know of as Kellogg's cereal, there was a sanitarium there, like hot springs, where people would go to heal themselves. At the same time that this is going on, or maybe slightly before it, in Saudi Arabia, which was not Saudi Arabia at the time, it was still part of the Ottoman Empire, we have the rise of a new Muslim sect. And it was established by a person called Muhammad ibn al-Wahhabi. And he lived from 1703 to 1792. And he's a mullah from Najd. He was really highly conservative, and he sought to purge Islam of its impurities. So the dervishes and other people, and in its sort of innovations. So this went hand in hand with Arab nationalist sentiments in the 19th century. These are people in this peninsula right here. They don't want to be part of the Ottoman Empire. They want to split off and become their own country. So today, Wahhabianism is the dominant form of Islam, and it comes from Saudi Arabia. Okay, and it's very conservative. Remember, I mean, in Saudi Arabia, they still execute people by stoning or remove hands, things like that. Then we have a new faith, and it's called Baha'i, and it comes from Persia, and you can look it up, but it's a monotheistic religion. So there's a boy who is viewed as the it's sort of like Jesus, but it's not quite the same thing. But and I don't want to denigrate their religious beliefs, so you should look it up. But it comes out of 19th century Persia, which is today Iran, and it has an emphasis on spiritual unity of all people. And it's definitely, if you look at the information, it's it's strongly influenced by Islam, which makes sense since at this point Persia is Islamic. But some people would consider this to be heretical by conservative Muslims, and practitioners often of Baha'i faith are targeted for oppression by the Muslim or the Hindu people, depending on if it's in India or Pakistan or Persia. It doesn't really have a very profound influence on Western Europe until the latter part of the 20th century, so like after 1950. But it was a major concern for people in Persia, in the Ottoman Empire, and the Arab leaders of the 19th and 20th century. And now today, there's roughly 5 to 6 million followers, and they're in 200 different countries. So, and that's it. Okay. Now, I wanted to get to this part. You have a question. How did the natural sciences, the inventions, and the social sciences, how do they relate in broad terms? Well, how they relate is this. You have a movement, right, from sort of like an amateurish style where people just sort of collected things and try to figure things out. And then now what they have is they've become professional. So you have people in, say, the early 19th century. They're using science to figure stuff out, like how to make a better steam engine, right? But by the late 19th century, they're figuring out how to make electricity and then use that electricity to power things. So what they have in broad terms is that there's this sense of discovery, there's a sense of trying to understand how the world works, and then there's a movement away from amateur and a movement towards professionalism. Okay. And then question 2, how is the fringe a reaction to the science and the inventions of the time? Okay, so you have people, like I said, they're 40, 50, 60 years old. They understand a life in which you work sun up to sundown, you ride on horses, you have to have lots of kids because they're going to die. And all of a sudden, you have vehicles moving on streets that don't have horses, right? It looks like magic. You have trains that are powered by electric motors instead of being pulled by horses. You have lights 24 hours a day. You have heat coming out of a radiator, an electric radiator. There's all of these changes. So you have lots of people who no longer have a job, right? Think about this, you guys. As soon as electricity comes around, do you really need whalers to go out and keep killing whales? Now, I realize the whales are dwindling in numbers at that point, but no, you don't need them. So if you don't need whalers, that means you don't need shipbuilders. If you don't need shipbuilders, that means you don't need people, lumberjacks cutting down trees and stuff like that. So there's this ripple effect. And so people's world, if they had understood and lived for decades, it's all upside down. And I would argue that even to this day, many people, even though they're taught these things in school, they don't actually understand how things work, okay? Like scientifically. And what I mean by that is, you guys should understand how electrons move in the copper wire, and that's how we get electricity, right? And how we are able to power things. I mean, there's an entire movement out there that thinks that the 5G network towers are producing the coronavirus. There's no connection. It doesn't even make sense. But there are people that just don't understand the world that they live in. And so they're on the fringe, and they will grasp anything that makes sense to them because they cannot understand the scientific literature. And that's kind of why I put that that slide in there with Einstein. I mean, if you cannot explain something in a simple way, then you don't really understand it very well yourself. And so that's what happens. That's what question 2 is. That's why I have this move. The other thing is as you have a reduction in religion, right, and its power, you have the occult that will rise. These people, because people want to believe, many people do, they want to believe that when you die, your spirit goes somewhere. And when your religious faith is challenged because somebody says, "Look, I've studied the Bible, and there's all of these contradictions, and these things that it says happened didn't really happen." People are looking for something to comfort them, something to make them want to go on, believe. And that was kind of like what Nietzsche was saying is like, if you don't provide people these things, then they'll fall into nihilism, and nihilism leads to awful, awful places. And so some people who couldn't, continue to go to church and swallow what they were being taught, they turned to other forms of mysticism. Now, this didn't affect everybody, you guys. By far, most people just continue to live their lives just as they always did. And the other thing is religion will adopt these things. Like the Catholic Church will adopt, like, that the earlier works of like Copernicus and such, that they were right and that the church was wrong, and they will issue apologies and stuff like that. So like they do evolve as well over time. So, and like, there's no there's no institution anymore from the church like going out and finding heretics and burning them at the stake, because lots of what these people are doing would be considered heresy by religious doctrine. So the answers to the questions are very, very small. Okay, it says broad terms. Okay, that's what I'm looking for. Just give me broad answers, and that's it. Okay, if you have any questions, please let me know.